Welcome to Pimpy's Investment Chat, where we keep investment talk simple. And here's your host, Pimpy.
What is going on out there, peeps? All right, so yesterday I did a video covering one of the key economic factors that Iraq has to take in consideration if they're going to decide to delete the zeros or change the exchange rate. We were talking about inflation. We wanted to see where Iraq stood. And based on that, we can decide whether or not Iraq was in position to make these changes. And what we found out is Iraq is where they need to be. They need to be between 2 and 4%. Although right now it's around 5%, but on average, overall, Iraq stays between 2 and 4%. So Iraq is in a good position as far as inflation is concerned. But if you've seen Dr. Shabibi, he was talking about when you delete the zeros, you really have to pay attention to inflation. But that's the same thing with increasing or decreasing your exchange rate. So now, when we talk about whether or not Iraq is going to reinstate the 322 rate, or if they're going to go up in increments, as I go through this video, you'll be able to determine on your own without depending on anybody else telling you. All right, so let's get into this. Before we get started, do me a favor, hit the thumbs up button. If you're not a subscriber, please do so, because when you do, it helps out the channel, and I certainly do appreciate it. If you're thinking about buying gold and silver, head on over to our friends at Miles Franklin. The link will be down below in the description. When you make your purchase, make sure you use promo code PIMPY, P-I-M-P-Y, and they'll take care of you. If you have any additional questions, you can reach us over here at this phone number or over here at this particular email. For all orders over $10,000, reach out by email and we'll make sure that you get a great deal. So come on over to Miles Franklin and add to your precious metal inventory. Okay, so any decision that the Iraq government makes in regards to their exchange rate is going to affect the inflation. And if you affect inflation, that affects your overall economy. That's why it's important to really monitor what happens to the inflation. So inflation refers to a rate at which the general level of prices for goods and services in the economy is increased over time. So, just think of inflation as a balancing act. If inflation goes too high, that means the cost of everything also goes up. If it's too low, you can have people overspending. So when consumer demand for goods and services exceeds supply, it can lead to an increase in prices, as businesses may raise prices to balance supply and demand. That's what you don't want. That's an increase in your inflation. Increased government spending, particularly when not matched by increased taxation or other revenue sources, can lead to a higher demand for goods and services, potentially driving up prices. That's an increase in your inflation rate. We know what's going on with their taxation over there in Iraq. Iraq's taxation system is characterized by inefficiency and corruption. The government has been struggling to enforce tax laws and collect revenue from various sectors of the economy. As a result, tax evasion and avoidance are rampant, leading to a significant loss of government revenues. And we know Iraq's trying to do something about that. Part of their reform is putting together a different taxation system altogether. So they are trying to address this, but keep in mind, because of where they are right now, an increase in the exchange rate can cause inflation to go up. Expansionary monetary policies, such as lowering interest rates or increasing the money supply, can stimulate spending and contribute to inflationary pressures. We know Iraq has been going out of their way to encourage their citizens to borrow. And remember that they were doing everything they can to get people into the bank and borrow money, whether you needed an apartment, whether you needed a house, a car. They were campaigning to get more citizens to take loans, and the loan rates were pretty low. And as far as increasing the money supply, if you make too much money, then what happens? The value of the currency goes down. When the cost of producing goods and services increases, such as raising wages and raw material costs, businesses may pass these costs on to the consumers in the form of higher prices. That's an increase in inflation. Disruptions in the supply chains, natural disasters, geopolitical events can lead to a sudden decrease in supply, causing prices to rise. So you see how this is a balancing act? All these things could affect the inflation. The fact that Iraq currently is in a sweet spot on average is pretty surprising. So again, inflation affects the economy in a way that if inflation is too high, people spend less. If it's low, then they buy more. And I know you're thinking, well, buy more is a good thing. It should make the economy strong. Well, if they're buying too much, you can have an overheated economy, and then you'd have to increase the money supply or increase interest rates to balance it out. So you want to find that happy medium is what you're trying to do. As of 2023, Iraq ranks as the 36th largest exporter of goods and 49th largest of importers of goods. Now remember when I was saying the reason why Vietnam's currency is really low is because they're mostly an exporting country, where Iraq is mostly an importing country. The fact that Iraq is up there 36 in the world sounds like they do a whole lot of exporting more than they do importing. Here's the crazy thing. The country's exports are primarily based on crude and petroleum products, which account for over 90% of its total export earnings. So it's not like Iraq has a lot of things that they can export out to the world. Their main export is oil. Now, this is from 2021. I don't know why there's not one higher, but there isn't. The top exporters of Iraq are crude petroleum, refined petroleum, gold, petroleum coke, petroleum gas. You get it. It's mostly oil and petroleum products. As far as imports are concerned, the top imports of Iraq are refined petroleum. Now, when I saw that, that blew my mind. You would think that one of the world's largest exporters of oil would have a refinery. Well, they do, except for they're very outdated, and from years of conflict, they're very damaged. So they cannot keep up with the demand as far as refining products are concerned. We know that al-Sudani has put a ton of money updating his refineries. Now, once that happens and they're able to meet demand, this amount of money for imports should pretty much disappear. They should be able to handle this on their own. So that will bring down their import costs big time. But more importantly, their ability to refine petroleum would bring them a ton of money. That's a big money maker. So if they're able to get the refineries up and running, that's a lot of extra money coming into Iraq. But the other products are broadcasting equipment, cars, jewelry, packaged medicine. Also, you can see right here, Iraq was the world's biggest importer of wheat flour. But once they get their agriculture going, they'll be able to do it in country. Now again, these things have an effect on our overall exchange rate for Iraq. It's important that you know these things because you'll have an idea on whether Iraq is going to reinstate a 322 rate or are they going to go up in increments. With the assumption that Iraq is going to increase their exchange rate, here we go. There are several ways in which increase in exchange rate can affect inflation. So imports, exports. An increase in exchange rate makes a country's exports more expensive in foreign markets, which can lead to a decrease in demand for these exports. Again, I bring up Vietnam because they're mostly an exporting country. They don't mind having a cheap currency. It makes them very competitive on the market, and they end up exporting more things than they import. If a country wants to be competitive on the trade, they want to make sure that the things that they're producing have a fair value or cheaper so you can compete with other countries. Now, if you increase it, imports become cheaper, leading to an increase in demand for imported goods. This change in demand can affect the overall price level and consequently inflation. So yes, you increase your exchange rate and you have more purchasing power. That means the price that you pay for imported goods is cheaper because you get more for your buck. But if you're not careful, it could cause inflation to go up. And that's because if you spend more money, then you need more money. That means that Iraq might have to print more money. And that's not good for Iraq because then that would cause a devalue in their currency. Plus, the overall price levels go up. That's hitting the consumer's pockets. That means Iraqi citizens got to pay more money. So increase in exchange rate is bad for exporting goods, but most of Iraq's exports have to do with petroleum. We'll get into that a little bit more here in just a moment. Because in my opinion, Iraq doesn't have to worry too much about exports going up because the products that they export are in demand anyways. It's not like they have a lot of other products going out there. So an increase in their exchange rate, in my opinion, won't affect them that much as it pertains to exports, of course. Competitiveness and production cost. A higher exchange rate can make domestic production less competitive, as foreign producers may be able to offer lower prices due to their weaker currency. This may lead to a decrease in domestic production, which can put upward pressure on prices and contribute to inflation. Inflation is important when determining your exchange rate. So if you just slap a 322 exchange rate on there, what do you think that's going to do to the economy? It's going to cause inflation to shoot up and get out of control. If you go up in small increments, you can monitor inflation and it won't jump up and shock the economy all at once. Small increments, if it has any kind of shock to the economy, it'll be very small compared to increase of 322 rate. So this is why a lot of major companies in the United States take their production elsewhere. They go to China, Malaysia, Vietnam. They do it because the cost of production and labor is way cheaper because their currencies are cheap. So if Iraq wants to bring businesses into Iraq, they have to be careful about what they do with their exchange rate. Because if an investor wants to go into Iraq and start producing stuff that they can export out, it can have an overall effect on the wages of the employees and the cost of supplies and goods domestically. Monetary policy. Central banks may respond to an increase in exchange rate by adjusting their monetary policies. If the exchange rate increases, the central bank may decide to raise interest rates to prevent the economy from overheating. So this could lead to the slowdown in economic growth and ultimately a decrease in inflation. So if you have an increase in prices, that's an increase in inflation, and everybody slows down and the economy growth slows down, that could cause deflation. Prices might drop back down. You want to find that happy medium. Inflation expectations. Changes in exchange rate can affect inflation expectations, which are crucial for determining actual inflation rates. If investors and businesses expect the exchange rate to continue appreciating, they may adjust their prices and investment decisions accordingly, potentially leading to changes in inflation. For those of us who are invested in the currency, well, an increase to the exchange rate is good for us. But if companies are looking to expand and grow and invest more into their company, depending on where inflation is, it could affect their decision making. A growth in a company can lead to more employment, updated technology, updated equipment. Too high of an inflation rate means they won't be able to expand. So here's what I was talking about when it comes to exports. Since 90% of Iraq's exports are in oil, you'd be surprised what increasing the exchange rate will do for Iraq. Increasing Iraq's exchange rate could have several potential effects on its oil exports. Changes in the exchange rate can impact country's economy and trade. In the case of Iraq, a change in the exchange rate could affect its oil exports in the following ways. Remember, Iraq wants to be competitive in the trade market. Increasing their exchange rate would cause the items that they are exporting to go up in cost. But like I said, since 90% of the exports is oil, well, this is different. So an impact on revenues from oil exports. An increase in Iraq's exchange rate could lead to a stronger Iraqi dinar relative to other currencies. This would mean that for each unit of oil sold, Iraq would receive more foreign currency. Iraq's revenues from oil exports could potentially rise. So they can increase their exchange rate, and what they could do to balance that increase in their exchange rate is either increase or decrease their oil production, and that would help balance it. And we also know that their foreign currency reserves have increased to 115 billion. Increasing the exchange rate would also increase their currency holdings, which is good because they can use that to protect the Iraqi dinar. So an increase in exchange rate would benefit Iraq big time. Competitiveness in the global market. Conversely, a higher exchange rate could make Iraq's oil more expensive for international buyers, potentially reducing Iraq's competitiveness in the global market. Other oil-producing countries with lower exchange rates may be able to offer oil at a lower price, making them more attractive to buyers. I wouldn't worry about that too much. Iraq's part of OPEC. Like I said, the increase or decrease in their production can help balance that. Domestic economic effects. A higher exchange rate could also impact Iraq's domestic economy. It might make importing goods cheaper for Iraq's consumers and businesses, which could affect domestic industries and consumption patterns. The only way it could affect the domestic industries is if it's cheaper for consumers to buy other goods from other countries than it is to buy the same product in Iraq. So let's just say we're talking about TVs. Let's say an increase in the exchange rate makes the TVs made in Iraq more expensive to export. If another country is selling the same TV for cheaper, people would be inclined to buy that imported TV because it's cheaper instead of buying the domestic one. So it would have an effect on businesses that are in Iraq, especially if the same products are offered lower in other countries. But again, 90% of what Iraq exports is oil, so that shouldn't be too much of a problem. Investment and production costs. Changes in the exchange rate can also influence investment and production costs for oil companies operating in Iraq. A higher exchange rate may affect the cost of imported equipment, technology, and services used in the oil industry. Well, if they have to import equipment, technology, and services, obviously the imports are going to be cheaper because they have a higher exchange rate. They have more purchasing power. Also, like I was saying, a higher exchange rate would allow businesses to expand if they wanted to grow, update their equipment, update their technology. So my concern with Iraq is if they increase their exchange rate, that would not allow them to be very competitive out there on the world trade, because there'll be people who can offer similar products for cheaper. But the truth of the matter is Iraq doesn't have very much to export. 90% of the export is oil. In this case, increasing the exchange rate would help them. It would increase their foreign asset reserves, and to balance the cost per barrel of oil, they can either increase or decrease to counterbalance the increase in the exchange rate. So you don't want to increase the exchange rate too high, like at 322, because you can cause the economy to overheat and prices to shoot up. It's one thing to have the cost of goods go up slowly versus, you go in there and you buy a dozen eggs and it costs you, 10 cents, versus all of a sudden you wake up the next day, you go there and it's like $1.10. You're like, what the hell? So this should give you some idea why it is that Iraq does not want to reinstate the exchange rate at $3.22. It would crash their economy. Now, going up in small increments would make sense. Where the real effect, in my opinion, on the inflation is going to be when they have to print more money to cover when people are going out spending money. So this is where the deletion of the zeros come in. If Iraq keeps the banknotes that they have, that means you're going to need more banknotes. That means you have to print more. And if you increase your money supply, that is going to cause the value of your currency to go down. Think supply and demand. The more of you have of something, the less valuable it is. So what does that mean? You have to get rid of the 3 zeros. By getting rid of the 3 zeros, that means you need less bills to go make purchases. So like these other content creators always joke around, well, why do I want to carry a big ass wheelbarrow of dinars to go buy a car? Well, if you take the zeros off of the banknotes, you won't need to bring a big wheelbarrow in. So do you see how this works? Do you understand how it's really important for them to pay attention to inflation? Do you also understand why they can't do a 322 rate? It would be such a shock to their system. You can cause the economy to crash. Deleting the zeros won't make that big of a difference when it comes to inflation, because that's not changing the exchange rate. But changing the exchange rate has a huge impact on inflation and your imports and exports. So yeah, I think Iraq can easily go up in increments. This will allow them to really monitor the inflation. This will also increase the quality of life for the Iraqi people. But Iraq has a few more things they really have to fix. Taxation, their tax system in general. In addition to that, they have to learn how to balance a budget. Just because they had a surplus from the other year, that's not normal. That's because, remember, the surplus is a carryover from 2022, if you think about it, because there was no government in 2022. Halfway through 2023, they established a government. So, of course, they're going to have a surplus. But prior to that, they were borrowing, all the time borrowing. Balancing their budget, fixing their tax system would go a long ways in Iraq. I hope that helps give you a better understanding and gives you some kind of idea of how Iraq is going to handle the exchange rate. Anyways, I look forward to your comments. I'll catch you later. I am out.